Right, the floor's open. Please just raise your hands and catch my eye. And if you catch my eye, two things. One, just say who you are and who you represent. And secondly, be brief. And we'll start with you, sir.
Hi, I'm Anders Lusgarten from the Bretton Woods Project. It's really, really interesting, and it's just brilliant to see the amount of stuff that isn't available. Visually, that's just a very, very compelling image. I wanted to ask you something substantive. I don't know if the method of investigation has anything to do with substance, but you said there's no pattern. There does seem to be quite a clear pattern in that 3 of the worst offenders, the EIB, USAID, and our friends at CDC, are all leading the charge into private equity and are leading the charge into things that are inherently getting into bed with people that do not want to disclose information. And I wonder if there's any kind of, as that becomes more and more apparent, and that shift towards private equity and financial intermediaries and things that are inherently kept away from public disclosure, is that going to get worse? Is that something that's reflected in your research, or is that not possible?
We'll collect a few questions, then I'll invite people to respond. Let me take the lady here, please. Just wait for the mic, which is about to reach.
A lot of people around the world,
please introduce yourself.
Women for Justice and Peace. Many people around the world must be thankful that you are interested in publishing what you fund. I think it will mean publish what you receive also. Because conflict insensitive aid has, hopefully this will reduce conflict insensitive aid, and which has been exacerbating conflicts, intrastate conflicts, actually in the last half a century. I can quote Sri Lanka, where people have just been under genocide for the last half a century. The oppressive government has never known sharing its own fund or whatever it receives from others with ethnic minorities. Hopefully this will in the future help the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take gentleman at the back.
Ian Elgie, Chair of the United Nations Association Eastbourne. I'd like to just pick up on the first comment which Lenny made, and probably addressing to Karen this point. In your executive summary, you mentioned that 8 very different organizations have started publishing to the agreed ERT format. So my question would be, are there any specific elements of the format which people are dragging their feet on, or is it, as Lenny was suggesting, perhaps governance, government structures, lethargy, creaking bureaucracy? Is there any specific which is holding back these other aid donor actors? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me say we've had a couple of questions from Anne Denaya Usher from Development Today Journal, which many of you will know, based in Oslo. Karen's one for you here, which she asks about the BRICS. She says that China is included, but none of the other BRICS as far as I can see. How useful is it to include China in this index, and do you aim to include other BRIC countries in future surveys? She also says that she notes that 3 bilateral agencies are among the top ranked, Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark, though from a British point of view I think she may have missed one out there. Can you say something about what's special about these and what they would need to do to enter the good category? So let's have responses. Karen, I guess you're going to have to go first for this because there's rather a lot aimed at you, but I'll give the others an opportunity to come in if they wish.
For those that need, this is going to sound trite, but I mean it, the easy way to do better is to publish more. So for the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark, the reason why the UK scored less was because they didn't have the India strategy paper available at the time. That's one of the reasons why they do less well than they might have, and because of the weighting on that. Sweden, yeah, there's different answers for them. Actually, the Netherlands data is incredibly high quality. It's probably the highest quality, I think, that's in the IATI data set. So that's not fully picked up on this, but it is partly reflected by the height of where they've come. In terms of the China was included partly to start testing whether this methodology works in those contexts, but also because we did a piece of work with the Stellenbosch China Institute, which I think we've got copies of on some people's seats, which was really about starting to answer the question about China. I think we are absolutely considering extending it to all sorts of different actors, and this was the the bit I didn't talk about, which could be UN agencies. We've only got one in there at the moment. That's a fairly obvious gap. It could be climate finance type flows. It could be private equity moving into that. Again, part of the reason why CDC and IFC and IEB are in there was to start testing whether the methodology worked on it. But I think we partly are looking for advice as to where we extend. We can't add another 30, well, maybe we can with enough people volunteering to fill in the survey. So if everybody in this room fills in a survey, maybe we can extend it to all of them. But the issue is going to be, where do we put our resources in terms of BRICS versus climate finance versus UN agencies, etc. I do think we need to keep a sense of perspective on things like the BRICS, though, because China is roughly funding about the same as Switzerland right now, we think. I mean, it's a bit hard to tell. So China should perhaps be in there, but you know, a lot of the other BRICS are funding very small amounts. But they will also be increasing, and they're significant in some neighbourhoods. So, you know, there's a set of questions there. On the private equity question, I think it's a really interesting one. We started trying to address it. I mean, I think we chose the unit of account for CDC, for example, to be the fund, which is fairly generous actually as a decision. But I think particularly with things like CDC, as they start to direct finance, this is about their contracting. This is about how they contract investment funds and what they write in those. So I think there are some really important questions around this, and it was one of the reasons why EIB is in there as well, is that, as you say, there's this push to put money back through those institutions. And it was a conversation we actually had with the European Commissioner, that it would be an enormous pity if great Europaids becoming more transparent, but more money is then being funneled through EIB, and actually the overall transparency levels start to drop. So we're going to need help in figuring how do we choose and select so that we don't end up not covering large proportions of the environment. And to the extent that this index going forward will provide incentives, which it sounds like at least in European Commission it will, how do we actually make sure that we don't start to leave out very large chunks of resources? And just, I mean, maybe to add in a word on what we're planning to do next is put this all on an online platform. This was done manually pretty much this time due to some amazing people sitting over in that corner and 48 other organisations working on this globally with us. But what we really want is NGOs in Colombia to be able to sit down and fill in the survey for Colombian donors in Colombia. This is all sampled at the moment. So the UK is India, and then it's one project for India. And we don't know what the variance is. Well, that's not true. We do know some of what the variance is, but for some of the donors we don't. For the State Department, actually it's really hard. We have no idea how, not no idea, we have some idea how representative the sample we've taken is, but it's not great. And what we do, and this is partly that this needs to be extended and become an online tool for other people to fill it in for their sets of donors in a context, or for people to do it on water and fill it in for water projects and start to look at actually what do we know about water project transparency or HIV project transparency, so that we build this online data set that people can then go into and use as they wish and pull out the elements that they want. And that's being built as we speak with Global Integrity and the online. If you go to a transparency tracker, it's not Publish What You Fund branded. It's not about us. This is very much a tool that we're hoping that will take off. Publish what you receive, absolutely. And I think, you know, this is for example, CABRI in Africa is very much looking at that commitment and what this implies for partner countries. In Publish What You Fund, we very much focus on the donor side, partly because everybody is always telling partner countries to publish what they receive, to better or less extent, but that this is the counterpart of that the donors need to publish as well. So that we work quite closely with the budget transparency movement as well, but we feel our responsibility stops with aid. And I just want to echo your point that the aid transparency is not going to prevent the re-securitization of aid. You know, the way money was spent during the Cold War era was very different from now, and we have significantly rode back from those funding patterns. But it's going to be very hard to keep that line, and especially under the pressures that we're having as a planet at the moment, to not re-politicise in very overt ways, and let's not pretend it's not. But actually that aid transparency is a prerequisite for having a better quality conversation, because if you don't know till 2 years afterwards what the spending pattern is, the political decisions have all been taken. So that actually this real-time information is part of that. Oh, and the really interesting one about why donors do badly, I think it really varies by donor, actually. So I'm not sure the World Bank is partly due to 20 years of NGO pressure on transparency of the World Bank. It's a win for people like Bretton Woods who've been at this one for some time. I think, the US one's really interesting, but the MCC does really well. So I'm not totally sure that it is about the US political context that means it's impossible for Congress to accept this stuff, because they are. I think a lot of it is inertia. A lot of it is, this is really hard. And then it turns out not to be that difficult, but it wasn't the right technicians being asked. I mean, this is, anecdotal, but I think this is a lot about talking to IT people. And I've tended to have two reactions talking to IT people. Either they sort of suck their teeth and go, that's going to be really, really difficult and near impossible. Or they go, yeah, okay, well, we've got 80% of that or 30% of that. How do you want it? and so I think it's a lot about getting down to those types of, and in that sense, transparency is a difficult one because it's a political and a technical issue. It's not really a policy issue, in the sense of it's not about people at the policy level having to do very much once the politicians have decided and the technicians have been told to do it. So in the way we change things in the aid business, that's quite hard because we tend to focus on the policy level, whereas this is technical and political, which makes for a really interesting skill set in Publish What You Fund.
I think you've done a great job, Karen, in responding to that. I'm not sure, do other panelists want to comment on that group of questions, or should we get some more?
I think she's really covered.
Yeah, that was my impression. Let's go try some others. I've been looking too much at people right in front of me. Let me look over there. Yes, please. Let the mic come to you first. And let me say to those of you online, by all means, feel free to add to the questions from outside this room.
Josh Arnold Forster. I don't represent anybody. I'm fascinated by it. I mean, first of all, excellent piece of work, as ever. Second, to come back to the comments on fragile states, I do think that's a particularly interesting debate about donor transparency, aid transparency in fragile states. Actually, I think the case really is for much greater transparency about aid and what, not just levels, but what we are actually doing with it, and how we do try and look at effectiveness, because I think there's certainly in this country, and I think in other countries, there is a great deal of debate about aid effectiveness in fragile states, and that will continue. And I think one of the things that the development community should embrace is a much greater and a much better informed debate about this. How do development agencies approach issues relating to security? What do they do about it? Why do they go to some places and not to others? How do they approach the issue of enhancing security for their own staff? That sort of thing. I mean, I think, and that comes back to, whilst I absolutely hope this is, this is now part of an annual publication, I would urge Karen to move on to publish why you fund what you fund. That's the next step.
That's a good suggestion of a new publication. Yes, please. Mike is coming.
Thank you. I'm Ronald Snack from DFID. I've got a couple of quick questions. The first one is directly for Karen. How do you see the index now evolving in the future? Lenny's already sort of raised some interesting questions about how it actually needs to address sort of country level issues, how it's actually used. That's one thing. Another thing is that while it's a really impressive collection of information on what people are doing, it's still kind of mechanistic. Do we publish this? Is it collected? Whereas we could still be asking questions like, what do we actually do with this information? Is there a feedback mechanism in place? Do people act on anything that we've learned? That's my first question. My second one is directly for the whole panel about Busan. What can we realistically hope to achieve on transparency from Busan? I mean, the Chinese, one of the Chinese ministers, I believe, a couple of days ago said that transparency shouldn't apply to South-South cooperation. So what are we actually aiming to get and how? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you had a question.
Yes, my name's Till Bruckner. I used to work as an aid monitor for Transparency International Georgia, but I'm not representing anyone here. I've got a question for His Excellency the High Commissioner. And Karen Christensen has pointed out that the reason why the World Bank is so transparent in this index is this sort of sustained NGO pressure over the last 20 years. But what I'm missing from this whole debate is, like, where's the pressure from the recipient countries on this? You know, donors have a need to give money institutionally. Do you see any scope for recipient countries just getting together and saying, well, if you're not transparent, we'll just not take your money?
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Kate Erdley from World Vision. Just picking up one of Lenny's points that hasn't been addressed so far. It was the role of parliaments in transparency, both in the bilateral donor countries and also the recipient countries. What does the panel see as the role of parliaments? And by default, the representation of citizens in that process?
I'll take one more before we have our next break. Yes, over here.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Carton. I'm an independent consultant with Macquarie. My question is really for His Excellency the High Commissioner, and it's about, going back to one of Lenny's points, about the actual use of this information, aid transparency at the country level. What I'm interested in is the proxy indicator of using IATI at the moment to say that therefore the aid is the aid is transparent and therefore can be integrated with the country budget in terms of its format, its accessibility and its timeliness. I know that Rwanda is one of the IATI pilot countries. I just wondered from your experience, from the experience of Rwanda, how that's been working out. Is IATI going to function, going to lead to greater integration in the end?
Thank you very much. We'll come back for more questions shortly. High Commissioner, would you like to go first on this group?
Thank you. Thank you. I think on the question from the gentleman from Georgia on whether countries are actually putting pressure on donors, I could speak on this from I would wish to see a situation where there is a stronger voice, common voice from recipient countries. I think that was what the objective was, to get like the AU to come up with a common position, which is, I believe, is one of actually the first time this seems to be happening on a big issue where the continent tries to come together with a common position. And I think the paper that they've tried to put together and the thoughts and the process that has gone into that, I think is a good process of beginning to garner some voice together. So I think those are processes that we need to continue. But concretely speaking, I think negotiated process like that become a little harder. But I think you see across a number of countries, I think countries that have a similar voice on issues of predictability, on issues of the need for aligning resources to country-owned strategies. There is also, I think, the other way to put pressure is to do your own bit, I think, and I speak that from the point of view of Rwanda, where I strongly believe that country-level ownership is still very, very important, showing that actually you can take the lead and being committed to a very positive and constructive dialogue with donors, but also putting your money where your mouth is by actually delivering on accountability, on development results. I think creates a lot of incentives, and also rather than pressure, maybe a pressure that is an incentive for everybody to align and deliver on the commitment. If you can see that happening across a range of countries, then you begin to see like-minded sort of recipients coming together, which I think has happened in some ways. And I think there are some countries that have been very, very strong contributors to the process leading up to the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, to Accra, and now also building to Busan. So I think you see that trend, but we need more. We need more to do that, to come with a common voice and a very clear message. And I think there's a process that should encourage that. What can we realistically achieve from Busan? I think I said it, action. I think we really need to move to come up with a practical, some practical steps on what actually is going to happen to ensure that commitments are made. I believe that it's easier to go and come back with another series of commitment. Then we have commitments piling up from the Paris Declaration, Accra, and others that have come, and then this is the fourth high-level forum. I think what we need is not just more statements of commitment, but actually a focus on a few actions that can. I don't know. I haven't seen any time frame, and I haven't seen any clear indicators in terms of how we'll hold ourselves to account post-Busan. And I think that's a big goal. I think we need to be moving. I think the process should involve looking at some of the commitments that are already there and coming up with a time frame of meeting some of the commitments, and that becomes a good negotiating platform to say we have a timeline. Like we've had a timeline on the MDGs. I think that was quite good. I think it built some bit of pressure for countries and for different actors to try and do something, and I think we've seen momentum build over the last bit of these 5 years. So I think that would be one way to look at it. On the IATA process, I think we've come quite a long way in terms of our planning, budgeting, and also implementation process. But it's been a long way starting even before with the process of building a mechanism for aid coordination. But I think what we did is that the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness created a lot of momentum for what we are doing already with our PRSP process, in order to use that actually to bring to create a framework for donors and government to dialogue constructively. When there was a stronger commitment on mutual accountability, we seized it at country level and actually started doing this ranking of donors, which came like a naming and shaming. So when you came up with this ranking of donors at country level, the senior technical people at country level were calling back their headquarters and saying, look, we are looking bad because we are ranked at the bottom. So it was a positive view, and yet nobody could contest it, because if you are asked to provide information and you don't provide information, then you get ranked as that. If there is a questionnaire on, there would be a questionnaire to government and a questionnaire to donors. So donors would provide the information they have, and government also. So the ranking, I think, was very good and put some peer pressure also on some donors. And you saw donors who traditionally would have been reluctant to provide budget support, actually realizing that this is a very transparent partnership where we have clarity of what the results we should be achieving, clarity of what resources are required, clarity that you have access to budget information. Actually, we started out by giving budget information to only budget support donors. So we say, if you are a project support donor, then you don't sit at the budget support harmonization group. So that donors, I think, found that very interesting, because then they all wanted to sit on the budget support harmonization group, because then that also creates incentive that we have the total access to negotiate the budget and push for your own areas of interest. If you are strong on health, you want to see more resources allocated to health, then you sit on the budget support harmonization group. But it became a very, very interesting process that now has filtered to where everybody is at the table and contributing equally. So I think there can be different experiences. I think some countries have had different experiences. Tanzania have had very interesting experiences. Mozambique, Ghana. I think you can look at a whole range of countries and see very, very interesting experiences. And probably the Rwanda one is just one of those.
Could I just ask one question about the Rwanda one, which goes with another question, which is about parliaments? How does this play in the relations between the Rwandan government and your own parliament?
So that's a very, very interesting one, because once we have agreed, and I used to go to Parliament to budget, to negotiate with Parliament on the budget. So we've agreed on a budget framework paper with all the donors. We've agreed on the different budget allocation with all the donors, and we go to Parliament, and Parliament sits us hard. Now the donors are not there, it's only the Minister of Finance. So to save our skin, we started the process of saying, okay, where we are discussing a particular sector, we're also going to bring the sector people in, so that the heat does not only focus on the Minister of Finance, so we spread it across, so we are defending. But we had also had task of cases where we have come up with, we've negotiated and had come up with an agreement with donors, and then Parliament wants actually to reallocate resources to other sectors. And that means it offsets the agreement that we have with donors. It made it very, very difficult for us to go back to donors and say, look, we had agreed for this allocation on education or for agriculture, but Parliament is pushing at this. So it was a very interesting, it remains even now a very, very interesting process, because the Parliament also has its own agenda, and it has on its constituents, it has also its accountability to the citizens, and it pushes hard and scrutinizes. But I think what has happened, that increasingly there is an understanding that this is a negotiated process, and when the more you become transparent, and at times we had to say to Parliament, look, we've had a difficult negotiation with donors, here's what we've agreed with donors. It should be up to you to take this decision. It's right in your remit to take the decision, but you should know that we have a difficulty of going back to the donors and saying that this has changed, because, and at times it could be something. The Parliament is strong on gender. They want to see a strong allocation on initiatives that are supporting gender. Yeah. Whereas we have to say, look, gender, but we also have education. We can't cut from education to gender. So it's a very, very interesting one. Remains so. But I think it has become increasingly a grounded dialogue that brings the executive, the donors, Parliament, and civil society. Civil society has also come on board, because the NGOs are also interested, particularly on poverty reduction issues. So it's a good question to ask.
Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, I think on the scoring mechanism, my experience is that embassies normally only report back to capitals when they look good, and not when they look bad, because that news is maybe going through other channels, of course. But on very quick on a few issues raised on why some countries are performing well and others are not. I think from the experience within the EU, that's, I think, on most topics, you always have a few champions, and you have a big middle group, and then you have a few clear opponents, and that goes for a lot of issues, and that's what you see here. And that, I think, also reflects the domestic policies. If there's I think UK is a clear example. There's, I think, government-wide clear emphasis on transparency. That also works out at the level of development cooperation and DFID. And the same applies, I think, to my own country. And with respect to what's said about parliaments, I think in the Netherlands it was a clear example that the parliament put pressure on the ministry to become more transparent, and that's why they had this emphasis on this one. And also within the EU, I think basically the score looks a bit like the score overall. If we look at aid effectiveness, there's a kind of correlation. The transparency scores are more or less in relation with how we scored on the Paris Declaration. Specifically, let's say on the new EU member states, it's clear that they are just developing their programs, so they have difficulties with policy, with politics, but also technical issues. So I think that's, a justification why they are not performing that good yet. There was this issue raised, not really addressed, on headquarter field gap, as I call it, and that's, I think, what you see across the board with all these beautiful commitments. As the High Commissioner also said, we have a lot of commitments. We don't need more commitments. We need action, and that's, I think, that we often miss the good communication between headquarters agreements, international agreements, and implementation on the ground, and specifically on transparency, because in our case we take this information, for instance, on IATI from our systems, and these systems are filled by our people in the field, and still there is sometimes differences in what they communicate, for instance, to the partner government and what we have in our systems, and that's to me it's a bit of a secret how that can happen. But that's I think we really have to address in the implementation now. On the fragile states, I can be short. There's no differentiation in what we put up on information on IATI, for instance, whether it's Afghanistan or Mali, it's the same. We only protect, but that's across the board, names of people. They are not included. That's a policy line. So how can we use this index? I said it before, I think it clearly emphasizes the weaknesses specifically for the Commission, but I think it also applies to the other member states. And we can address that, but Karen can correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, if you have IATI fully up and running, you almost score 100%, I would say, because it's so much based on the IATI standard. On Busan itself, specifically on transparency, I said there's this paragraph 20 out now. It includes some deadlines, some concrete proposals. As I said, it includes reference to IATI. It still has quite a few brackets in it. And again, I would say if we take those out but keep the language in, I think we are going into the right direction. There was also this question on raised by some of you, I think it was you, on China. Indeed, what I've seen from their position, they're very reluctant to agree on specific commitments which affect them. They agree, of course, on commitments which affect us, but to them it's more difficult. They even have doubts whether South-South cooperation should be included. But if you look at other, let's say, emerging economies and donors, the Mexicans, the Brazilians, quite active in this process, they're much more positive, and specifically on transparency, and they say we want to become more transparent. So we always focus on China, of course, because they're the biggest, but other ones are more positive in this respect. Yes, I think that was basically what I wanted
Karen,
to say.
anything to say on this round?
Maybe some quick additions. Josh, I agree with you on fragile states. I don't think that this is a less, in fact, possibly a slightly more important issue because they're more aid dependent. And actually, interestingly, for example, USAID scored better because Afghanistan was the sample country and because there are databases on Afghan aid, not run by, anyway, really messy and complicated, but nonetheless, they scored better on it. I think there is a whole set of issues about what information is excluded, and that really is based on the standard freedom of information principle, which is if it is going to cause harm that is something is excluded to somebody, it is excluded. So people working on gay rights in Uganda right now, exclude. And I think the way we haven't actually had to deal with this in the ranking yet, but I think we would, if the reason is given for why things are not disclosed, that counts as legitimate. So it's about naming the exclusions and about there being a challenge process for exclusions. So DFID originally in their first set of disclosure didn't include much on Afghanistan, but as it's increasing, as their disclosures going out in underwriting, it's increasing. So I think it's more important, but the exclusion issue isn't a fragile states issue, it's actually a general issue. And there are types of organisations for whom that is going to be a much bigger problem. So, for example, people that heavily fund human rights are going to have to figure out how to exclude much more systematically than those. But volume-wise, that's very, very small expenditures. DFID, the question from DFID on next steps. So what we're going to do is add some more questions to the survey, some more data points, some more indicators, which will include things like whether there is an online project database, who is responsible for publishing this information, who do you ask if it's not there, location data, geographical location data, and things like what languages it's included in. We are also going to have a really good look at this format and navigation issue, how to find the information. Format's not too hard. How to metricate whether or not it's easy to find is a really tricky one, and there are lots of people in the tech sector trying to do that, and I think we probably won't try and reinvent wheels, but I don't think we've got a good answer to that yet. How many clicks did it take to find it also depends on the clicker, so, you know, that's
takes a lot of time doing
I mean, if Mark's doing it, I have a lot of confidence that it will be reliable, but nonetheless, we really want to make sure that this goes into country level and it's available as a tool for people to do country level, because that is really important. But I think we need to be clear that what this is doing, what IATI is doing, it's getting it out of donors in ways that can be used at country level. It doesn't get it in there. Getting it in there, actually moving the data into those is really... And so to go to your question about IATI, this is all about this budget indicator, the budget identifier in IATI, and I think we're probably about 50% there, which means that there's two big aspects to getting aid on budget. One is timing. Getting it 6 months after the budget cycle, no help. You need it then. You need it to go into the budget. So that IATI is 3 months at the moment, which means it will basically map to any budget cycle, but that's it as a minimum, and some donors are doing it monthly, some are doing it weekly, I think, actually. So there's no reason why it can't be real time. But then the question is sector classification is the really big one, and we've been doing a lot of work with ODI on this as well and with the World Bank, and that just has to be nailed down so that it's never going to match 100%, but it makes it easier. The work we did with ODI and this proved categorically that donors have done terrible things to partner countries' health budget classifications, which means there's no standardization out there anymore, which means this will have to be manually mapped in the health sector by donors. Serves them right. But there we go. With other sectors, actually, there's a lot of commonality, and therefore, actually, you can get an 80-20 rule running where you start to get mapping going on.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to 2 o'clock. There was definitely one question there. I'll take one more, and then I think we'll wrap up questions to the floor. If I can have you, sir, and then you. I'm sorry not to be able to take any more, but we need to respect the time.
Hi, I'm Graham Gordon from Tier Fund. It's a question to do with use of the information by civil society and linking in with Publish What You Pay, and now the fact that companies are going to have to publish a lot more information, or particularly on their projects due to the new EU legislation that's going to come in next year. What learning can we take across from the transparency in aid sector to transparency in extractive industry sector, particularly in terms of uses by civil society, both at national and subnational level? Because if we think one of the aims of this work is to improve development, then actually one of the dangers is that it's just people with very high technical expertise that use it at a national level. I know that Lenny and Karen both raised that issue. How do you see this over the next couple of years? What are the main challenges and potential ways forward?
Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Sam Attridge from the Commonwealth Secretariat, and we've been watching the negotiation of the Busan outcome document very carefully, actually. And we have a position with regard to IRT, which was discussed and agreed by our Commonwealth finance ministers in September, where all of our partner countries actually committed to endorse IRT and also urged its donor members to adopt IRT. So I have a specific question, perhaps to Alex, on paragraph 20C in the current outcome document. You say that it's going in the right direction, and I agree. And I agree if we keep the bracket in. If we keep the bracket out, which contains IRT, I wonder how on earth the international community is going to agree a common standard in 1 year. And is it a missed opportunity? And should we be pushing much harder? Something like IRT or IRT compatible standard. I kind of can't help but feel that the international community is shying away from this, and it will be a missed opportunity.
Thank you very much. I've had one further question from our colleague in Oslo, and this is addressed to me. Question for Richard Manning as a former chair of the DAC. Following from the DFID question, which our colleague Ronald asked a minute ago, what do you think can or should be achieved in Busan in terms of integrating the new providers of assistance to the donor community on transparency, statistics and coordination? In this context, do you think it useful to include China or other BRICS in such an index? So I'll try and deal with that in a minute. In fact, I'll deal with that at the end. That's my chairman's privilege. Let's final comments from the group. Karen.
On the use issue, I think it's really hard to persuade people in partner countries to start chewing through data sets until there's a bit of time series. And I think it's going to take 3 years before we start to see real use of data, just because people have to believe it's there coming. I think I wouldn't spend a lot of time personally understanding data sets if you don't know that they're coming year on year. So I think, one, we just have to be slightly patient on that one. I think the second one is that the thing that's going to drive use at country level is relating it to budget information, because it's fascinating for us that DFID's doing X, Y, or Z potentially, but actually if you're sitting in Rwanda, what you want to know is what all of the donors are doing and what the government is doing. And so the ability to match it and map it up, I think that's when this is going to get used and become interesting, because that's when you start to have a significant constituency of people that are actually interested, because only a handful of us are interested in very original origin. Now, I mean, there probably are people in Rwanda who care whether it comes to the US or DFID, but mainly they care whether they're going to get it and whether it's hitting their district. And I think on the Busan issue, I completely agree with Sam that if the brackets come out, then we've kind of, what was that all about? They have to stay in. This is very esoteric for those of you who are not aficionados of the Busan outcome document version 4. But I think that the other key thing is that this issue around the timeline staying in, and they seem to be unbracketed now, which I think is really, really, really important, and a success to people like Rwanda and the Commission positions on this, and the Commonwealth position. I think the other one that's really interesting is China's position. I think there are two things going on here. Factually, of course, South Road should be more transparent. But I do think there's a question as to why include them now when these people weren't involved in serious levels of negotiation. And there's a little bit of me that's rather concerned that donors are using China's position as an excuse for them not to sign something, rather than because China's actually objecting. China's said throughout, we're not signing this, we don't consider ourselves a donor. So the conversation we're having with China at the moment is, are you a donor or not? Which is it's not the same conversation as should you sign this paragraph. And I do think there's a fair bit of using it as an excuse going on here potentially, because China's actually been incredibly clear on what they are and aren't going to sign. But
thank you very much. Alex.
Thank you, Richard. I'll take the easy one first. It's on the use of information. As I said before, I think that's really important, that if we speak about the Commission information, IATI publication, that people start reading it, using it, and start asking questions. Of course, a lot of people in our communication department won't like me for that, maybe, but I think that's why we have this information out. And what we can do is, as I said again, we have the standard there, so it's comparable, comprehensive information, but we can make it also more accessible, and that's, I think, why this exercise is good, because it's not always easy, even for me, to find information on our website. So the accessibility, that's our task. And I think there has been discussion in IATI maybe that should be continued, how we can help people to access information, and a kind of education program for people on how to use it. But that's something we need to think about. Then on the Busan paragraph 20, I don't know whether I understood it completely about the brackets now. I'm getting a bit lost. But at least there was this wording on design was in, and design a new standard. Our position, but that's the Commission and that's not the EU, I would say, was simply to say, let's adopt IATI as the standard for transparency, full stop. That would, because the standard is there, it's based on the DAC CRS to a large extent. So why not do it that way? And we should avoid developing another standard. At least that would be a nightmare for us, implementation-wise. We're not waiting for that. But this is a lot of text negotiation. So the EU position is, but I can read it out now.
Can I just suggest we go first to the High Commissioner, who's under pressure to get away,
okay,
and then we'll come back to you and give you a little bit more time.
I have a very long statement here.
That's better. Yeah. Actually, I think I didn't have just a question. I was just ignoring Richard that I have to go because I have another meeting. But I think we'll keep really closely on this. And I think all the questions. I don't think I had a specific question.
Well, thank you very much for your contribution. It's been really useful to have you today. We really appreciate this strong country-based knowledge. And I would recommend to anybody who hasn't yet read it, please read the African Position for Busan. It's an excellent document put together by African governments and civil society, and is a real pointer to how this whole process does have some real-world impact. And I think it's very, very commendable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alex, sorry.
Yeah, so I will now read out my statement. Again, on what's said in the Busan statement is now implement a common open standard, and it should build on achievements of IATI. So there's a lot of wording, and so it's a text of how many lines now? 6, 7. And then they say we'll build on this, we will agree on this standard. Well, basically, again, the standard is out there, so what to agree on, that we use it. So, but the EU maybe did a bit of a better job, and I will read it out. The outcome document should also encourage donors to address constraints to allow multi-year budgeting of development cooperation, so that's the midterm, 3 to 5 years rolling, etc. And to recognize the importance of meeting complementary global reporting and publishing standards based on the DAC CRS++ standards. Are you still with me? Which is, in brackets, the DAC's expanded creditor reporting system, which its concepts, definitions, classifications, and verification procedures, you see the compromise here, and the International Aid Transparency Initiative, respectively. The aim should be to meet inclusiveness, manageability, and implementation by December 2015. First part is difficult on December 2015, we all understand. In this context, the EU encouraged the DAC to become an international hub for transparency. So, but at least we have to meet the standards, and we recognize that the DAC is for reporting and that IATI is for publishing. So, well, let's see where it ends up.
Thank you very much, Alex. Just to couple of wind-up points from me then, and I'll then turn to this question from Oslo. I think this has been a very interesting discussion. I hope you'll feel the same, and I think that unquestionably, Publish What You Fund has really created a bit of space and momentum around this. And I think the index, which will be hotly contested, as every index always is, provides a very good lightning conductor for the kind of discussion we've been having. And I think the way it's being positioned today is not being a magic bullet, as Karen rightly said at the beginning, but as the High Commissioner said, something that can form part of an ecology of transparency that really moves things forward, I think is very powerful. In that context, I find it really quite interesting that everybody's reading this is version 4 of the Busan Outcome document. I was actually attended the Rome High-Level Forum when the document was drafted on the last afternoon, and I was heavily responsible for the Paris Declaration, which was mostly done in the smoke. Well, there wasn't any smoke in the room, but a room with no windows. There was no windows, no windows, and presented to an astonished group at the end. So I think transparency within this process has come a huge way as well. I have one piece of transparency which is not captured anywhere here, and I suspect is a lot of people really want out of this. And it goes back to my time. I was on the UK alternate on the World Bank board in the mid-1980s, and I discovered to my surprise and delight that there was a thing called the Monthly Operational Summary, in which the World Bank sent to all directors a note of all the projects in the pipeline. Yeah. Hadn't come to the board, in process, where they are, what the latest state is, when you're going to get it, and all the rest of it. And I remember going back to ODA, as it then was, and saying, why don't we have anything like this? And it took me 12 years to get, as a member of the ODA DFID Management Board, pipeline data from my own agency. I hope my different colleagues will confirm that something's still available to you today. But you would not believe how bad this is, even in a horribly organisation like ODA at the time. I'm sure that many people in this world would love to have pipeline data of the kind I used to routinely get at the World Bank 20-odd years ago as something which is out in the public domain, civil society can talk about, people can say this is what's going to come up over the next year or so. And I predict this whole transparency frontier can and should move upstream in this way, and that will actually produce some data which is really interesting, unlike some of the other data which is very nice for academics but not very useful for anybody else. Now, finally, the question from Oslo, which of course is a very good one. What do we do in this world where clearly the providers of assistance outside the DAC are becoming more important and will continue to do so? And this was brought home to me very strongly as chair of the DAC when the G20 finance ministers, anybody remember the G20 finance ministers? They've been going for years. They decided about 5-6 years ago that they would accept the Paris Declaration, and I got various letters from people like the Argentinian finance minister telling me that they did accept the Paris Declaration. The one from the Indian finance minister was the most interesting. It said the Indian government fully accepts the Paris Declaration in respect of north-south flows, but considers that south-south cooperation should be governed by considerations of mutual advantage, which is, you couldn't be much clearer than that. And I think we have to understand, and as Karen has indicated, to some extent respect this position. It's all very easy for rich countries who've been giving aid for years to say, or at least pretend, that they are somehow virtuous. But having worked for one of them over an extended period, when we were selling Western helicopters to India, the Indians didn't really need, when we were subsidising ships that we wanted to keep employment in British ports and the rest of it, we should look at our own transactions here and be a little humble about what we as DAC donors say to very poor countries like China, like India. I mean, India's not a very rich country. How can India run an entirely selfless policy of giving money to other people? It doesn't make a lot of political economic sense. So I think people have to understand this is the world we're in. These countries are very important. They're going to become more important. It is ridiculous to jump from that and to say that they've got to do the same thing as extremely rich countries who've been around for a long time and whose own practices, even today, are not beyond suspicion. I mean, we all know that. So I think the first thing is to be pretty serious about realism here. On the other hand, I do think that it's very important that countries move forward, and I do think that transparency is, in many ways, the easiest frontier. It's one thing to tell India that it should untie its aid and allow, say, Chinese firms to benefit from the poor Indian taxpayers' money. I mean, how would you like to sell that in the Lok Sabha? It's another thing to say, well, we should be transparent about what we're doing. And I was a little bit surprised when I read how badly China scored on your index, because I've also read your study on China, which shows that China publishes quite a lot of data. It obviously doesn't publish a lot of data that hits your index, but it's not as if China's doing nothing. And I think that we need to have a proper conversation. And let's remember that China Exim Bank is an export credit agency. You haven't asked ECGD what its policy is on transparency. I suspect if you went round US Exim and various other bodies, you'll get very similar responses than the ones you've obviously got from China Exim. So one needs to look quite carefully, and particularly at this semi-concessional part of the thing, and see what is really the practice elsewhere. None of this means, in my opinion, that the Chinese would be wise to paint themselves in the position that DFID suggests they're about to, of saying that South-South cooperation should not be transparent. I think if the Chinese want to get up and say that in public, that's not a very bright position to lock myself into, I would say. So I hope that when I first went to China as a DAC chair, the two words I tried to leave with the Ministry of Commerce were 1, sustainability, and 2, transparency. And I think these are two very important principles for any donor. And I think it would be a pity if China is not part of the party. So I very much favour the idea that in Busan there'll be certain principles everybody agrees to for everything, and then one has to look more carefully at what is actually delivered in different strands by different people at different stages of development, and have an intelligent conversation about this, and then have some decent monitoring system so you can tell whether people have done what they said they might do. That's quite enough from me. Thank you very much for everybody for taking part. And thanks to ODI for once again hosting this event. Thanks, Lenny, also to your contribution. I'm sorry I didn't come back to you. Is there anything you want to say at the end of this?
That's okay. No, I think it was a good discussion, and I can follow up with individuals. I had a few thoughts.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.